Tout le monde est revenu. Visiblement, les rangs se vident doucement. Alors, dernière conférence de la journée avant la restitution des travaux des différents ateliers. Conférence en anglais, donc il faudra être attentif et ne pas dormir pour cette dernière conférence. Comment assurer une transition écologique juste et équitable pour le transport aérien? À tort, donc on vous l'a souvent répété, l'aviation est considérée comme l'archétype de l'industrie polluante, ce qui aurait tendance à pousser certains à prendre des décisions radicales et non vertueuses. Les objectifs, notamment de l'Union européenne dans la déclaration de Toulouse, prévoient une aviation décarbonée à l'horizon 2050. Mais comment s'inscrire donc dans cette démarche vertueuse où personne ne doit rester derrière, ne doit rester sur les bords de la route? C'est inscrit dans cette déclaration. On va tenter de répondre à toutes ces questions. Conférence donc en anglais. Isobel is a speaker. Go ahead, Isabel.
Hello, everyone. Bonjour. Thank you very much for joining today's session on a just and ecological transition to sustainable aviation. My name is Isobel GIBSON. I work as a senior sustainable aviation consultant for ICF, and I'm joined by Rafael, Gabriel, Paul, and Christine today. So the purpose of this panel is to understand the broader impacts of aviation on the environment and society. So this means encompassing sustainability as more than just CO2 emission reductions and thinking about the three core pillars. So that's environment, society, and governance. All of these pillars have an important role to play in the fair transition. They're interlinked and they're interdependent of each other. So for example, when we think about electric aircraft, they both reduce emissions but also reduce the impact on local communities, and that's through as a result of the reduced noise or the quieter engines that are also offered by them. So when we think about this in the context of ATAG in 2050, at the ICAO General Assembly, states were urged to contribute to achieving the goal in a socially sustainable manner for a just transition. But what does that actually mean in practice? So I'm going to pass over to my panel members to provide a brief introduction to themselves, their organisation, what they do, and then we'll move into the first questions. And just to say as well, I will be asking you to ask some questions, so please keep engaged, keep thinking. I know that it's kind of getting later in the afternoon, but we do really appreciate that you're here. Thank you. I'll pass over.
Good afternoon. My name is Rafael SCHVARTZMAN. I'm the Regional Vice President for IATA, the International Air Transport Association. Well, again, I said IATA probably is the acronym, right, that you are more familiar with. We represent about 317 members around the world, but actually 117 members in Europe, about 57 countries. We have, also with 11 offices around the region. And we focus on setting standards, advocating for the industry, and providing some services as well for the industry, right? So in general terms, that's what we do. I'm based actually in our regional office in Madrid. We have a global office in our executive office in Geneva. Our headquarters is actually in Montreal, but we also have 4 other regional offices. So that's about it.
Hello, my name is Gabriel Mucho Rodriguez. I'm representing the ITF, the International Transport Workers Federation. We represent around 700 unions in 152 countries, and those unions represent around 20 million transport workers in all modes of transport. I'm responsible specifically for aviation. And we try to coordinate the work of the unions, represent them at international level, and help them when they need. I have to apologize because I cannot speak French. I can understand. I was following the discussions, but I'm horrible speaking. We could speak Spanish or Portuguese, but not French. I'm originally from Argentina. By the way, I was happy that the first panel was about the Olympics and not about the FIFA World Cup. It would have been very awkward for me being the only Argentinian. Put up your hands, all the Argentinians in the room. No, you see.
So, bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everyone. My name's Paul Steele. I am now an independent consultant, so I'm not representing anyone. My background is in business. I was 25 years working for some big companies. Then I discovered the environment and was the chief operating officer of the World Wildlife Fund before I found aviation. And that became my passion, sustainable aviation. I joined IATA as the Director of Environment in 2007 and was also the Executive Director of the Air Transport Action Group, which is still the only association that brings together the whole aviation sector, which are the aircraft and engine manufacturers, air traffic control, the airports, and the airlines. So in that role, I would say I had an exciting 13 years in total. I think my main claim to fame is that I was heavily involved in the development of CORSIA, the agreement that was reached in ICAO in 2016 to cap aviation emissions in 2020. I spent many man-years in dark rooms in Montreal, actually helping design the program, and then, of course, trying to help negotiate that and get governments to agree with the support of all my colleague members of ATAG during the ICAO assembly. So that's the key thing. As I said, now I focus more on sustainability, working both in the education sector in terms of teaching, but I'm also consulting on sustainability, and particularly in the broader tourism area, which of course is very closely associated with aviation.
Bonjour, good afternoon. I'm Christine Diamente. I'm delighted to be here. And first of all, I want to thank Isobel, fellow panelists, but especially Lunac, for organizing this conference. I've had the pleasure of being here part of the day and really enjoyed the discussions. I'm Managing Director of Business Transformation at BSR. BSR, Business for Social Responsibility, is a sustainability advisory network. We work with the world's largest multinational corporations who are members and who are committed to our mission of creating a just and sustainable world. And we work with them on insights, advisory, and collaboration regarding climate change, human rights, equity, inclusion, justice, business transformation. And we also work with them on the cross-cutting issues: just transition, climate justice, social justice. We are around the world. In Europe, we have offices in London, Paris, Copenhagen, but we're also in the United States and we're in Asia. We represent 11 industries, including the aviation and transport industry. My colleague Philippe Fontat, for example, is our key expert in that field. And in the area that I lead, business transformation, we work with companies, B2B and B2C, to transform them for long-term value. So it means looking at their strategies, looking at their targets, looking at their goals, looking at their governance. How are they governing for this just transition, this changing world that is rapidly changing and continuously disrupted at the Chief Sustainability Officer level, at the C-suite, at the board, across, up, down, and also outside in the ecosystem and across the value chain. I also look at ESG disclosure, supply chain, stakeholder engagement, as well as futures and foresight. Because as many companies and many actors today are making these long net zero goals to 2050, while we can have an idea of the short, medium plans, the long term still has to be positioned. And in this age of disruption, you need multiple potential scenarios. So we look at foresight as a tool. I've been at BSR 3 years and spent over 20 years in the corporate sector. I'm not from the aviation industry. I'm actually from the tech industry. And I'm a former Chief Sustainability Officer, Head of Brand Strategy, Head of Public Affairs, and worked on numerous transformations. So look forward to sharing some insights with you today, and also some of the work that BSR has been doing on the important topic of just transition.
Great, thank you very much. And it's great to see that we have such a broad kind of range of expertise across the panel. So really looking forward to digging into those 3 core pillars of sustainability. So aviation is a central part of lots of our lives, so lots of aspects of our lives. We use it for the transport of goods and services. We use it to visit friends, family, for business. There is a real question over how we ensure that we do have a just transition kind of looking forward over the coming years in the context of the strong environmental targets that we've set. So how, in this context, how do we think about achieving the environmental targets and what policies are needed to facilitate the continued operation of aviation in a carbon-constrained world? I think probably the best person for this is Rafael, but please do jump in. I think as representative there, I will hand over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Isobel. Obviously, I think all of us have, in a way, if we reflect about the value of aviation, you know, we have just passed, the COVID pandemic, right? And where we were basically all grounded, locked down on in some extreme cases where maybe, you know, Australia 2 years, right? So, and we were not able to either meet family members, you know, get together or, you know, move goods, or obviously we saw the value of actual aviation in the cargo companies or the cargo was, air cargo was actually bringing all the medicines or the things that we needed to fight this pandemic. Actually, for most of you, probably you know that cargo was actually flying more during the pandemic than before the pandemic, right? Because it was something that we needed to be able to fight this, I guess. But anyway, that's a bit of a reflection that how important aviation is. Now, when we talk about what do we need to do to facilitate the transition to a sustainable aviation, right? I mean, one of the things that we have to remember is one is that aviation, Paul was referring to CORSIA, right? Aviation has already a plan for net zero by 2050, right? A plan that actually has a roadmap already in place where 65% of it will be, it needs to be based on approximately SAF, right? Sustainable aviation fuels. 13% is technological, right? So it's technological, and then we have operational efficiencies that we can gain, and then there is 19% about carbon offset, and so there is a plan to get there. Now, how to get there? What governance or what support or how do we facilitate this? When we talk about SAF, for example, you hear in all around, especially Europe, where we have the highest ambitions in the world, that we are still not having enough incentives, if you would, right? Actually, we don't have incentive, we actually have mandates, right? So we believe that in this area, what we need is to be incentivizing the production of SAF to be able to reach this goal, because this is the only viable way, right? Obviously, when we say SAF, and we say 65%, there is a mix there where at some point you will be able to have sustainable synthetic fuels, right? Obviously something that requires a lot of investment as well for the future. There are other things, so one is the framework under how do we handle, right, the incentives to be able to get this SAF into production. The other, which is the biggest part of achieving the net zero. The other is, obviously, I mentioned some operational efficiencies before. We have one theme in Europe, which is very common, and most of us, some of us here are very familiar with, which is the inefficiencies that we have in the system here, in the air traffic management system in Europe, right? Which is the single European sky ambition that we have for 20 years or so, right? Where we could also improve the efficiency of the system, and according to some studies, get up to 10% of CO2 savings, right? So that is very important. And when I say, we keep talking about the single European sky and the progress that has not been made. If we are really serious about obviously bringing a sustainable business, we need to be serious about the compromises, right? That this brings, and this is one of them that is today immediately possible technologically, right? Which is not the same when we talk about obviously, technology that needs to be there in place, be it electric aircraft, hydrogen, and other means, right? Which will take a while. Probably other things that could help as well. You know, one of the things is, as in the pandemic, we now have other sectors that need to be involved in this discussion, right? So which means before it was purely, I would say, not purely, but mostly within the transport sector. So similar to the pandemic, where we needed to speak to ministers of health, for example, for certificates, Minister of Interior, you know, to coordinate the actions, right? So today, the stakeholders that we need to work with, or they need to work also with us, I mean, this is a challenge for all of us. It's not just for the airlines to find a way, right, if I would say, or air transport. We need to be able to have that working together. And one of the things that we have been part or trying to be part of, for example, is the formation of alliances, right? Where we have one in Italy, we have there is the Jet2 in the UK, there is in Spain also an alliance where what is an alliance is you have all the key stakeholders there, which is not just the airlines, obviously they're there, manufacturers are there. We have fuel producers. We have government. It could be transport. It could be energy. You know, we have even the environment and organizations as well. So because this is a challenge for all of us. So in that for example, in the Spanish case, there is a pillar linked in the work of the alliance, work in technology. There is a pillar working in regulatory. So these type of things are operational. So. I think we are facing a challenge, which requires us to look into the framework of who should be involved. We are talking, I think, with all these stakeholders, and I believe, again, the key focus here is, you know, in these areas that I mentioned before. I keep insisting on SAF because obviously, you know, we see a lot of initiatives that might be driving away from the focus, right, where the priority should be. But yeah, that's it.
Great, and I think knowing,
No, it's okay.
knowing that we have the most ambitious SAF targets in Europe, how do we match that from a social perspective? How do we ensure that we're also just from a human perspective?
I'll take this one. I think when you talk about policy, there's good policy and there's bad policy. And let me give you a couple of examples, okay? Let me start with the bad stuff, because I think we should focus on the good stuff. The bad stuff is the biggest single danger to aviation right now is populist politics. The politicians who just want to do something that looks good rather than something that makes a difference. We've got examples of that all over Europe. The most famous was the famous air passenger duty in the UK that was introduced as a tax, an environment tax. Not one penny of the more than £4 billion that were raised every year from that ever went back into helping the industry become more sustainable. We're here in France. There's some very good examples. It's a shame I don't know whether anyone's here from the Ministry of Finance, but the proposed budget 2024 of putting a tax on airports is going to do nothing to actually help the industry become more sustainable. And I think, you know, government should be honest and say, actually, this has got nothing to do with the environment. This is purely a way to raise money because it does nothing to actually help the industry move forward. So they're the sort of bad policy measures because they don't, at the end of the day, help anyone except the Treasury gain more money for their coffers. In terms of good policy, I think we've got a very good example when it comes to SAF. We talk about Europe. We're sitting here in Europe, but there is the rest of the world out there. And right now, the fact is that the US is much further advanced on SAF than Europe. And you have to ask yourself the question, why? And the reason is because in Europe, they use a stick approach. So we will mandate that you must use 2% by a certain date, 6%, whatever. And then they leave everybody else to figure it out. Whereas in the United States, they really get the message. And there they work on incentives. I mean, in President Biden's infrastructure bill recently, they put $100 million aside to actually support the development and the building of sustainable alternative fuels for aviation plants. If I look at all the new initiatives, we can't rely on the oil companies to do this. Most of the SAF that's provided today comes from new companies. This is where there's a real opportunity to create jobs and to create wealth. Companies in Europe like Neste and Sky Energy, in the United States, an exciting company called LanzaTech. These are all companies that have been struggling against immense competition from the oil companies to get started. And we need to incentivize rather than to mandate. And I think that's something that we can take away. And last point is, we really also need governments to do joined-up thinking between government departments, because you get the feeling that very often they don't talk to each other. Again, here in France, I was very encouraged a couple of years ago when they had the engagement, what's it called, the ECF, the engagement, I've got the note somewhere, which was an alliance to actually to do a study to promote the production and distribution of sustainable alternative fuels. So you see that happening, and then you see the tax proposition in the budget, and you go, well, where is the connection here between what governments are thinking?
Great, thank you. Christine, would you like to add to that?
Just very briefly, if I take a step back for a minute, we're in an age of rising stakeholder expectations where regulators and governments are but one actor in a series of stakeholders who are really putting attention on these issues: the environment, social impact, human rights, and governance. And Paul, you've given some excellent examples of positive and also negative policies. And unfortunately, whether we're talking about the environment or whether we're talking about ESG or climate, it has become the subject of some noise, some misinformation, and some manipulation. But if I take a step back in Europe, actually Europe is quite advanced when we look at legislation and having companies and actors, whether they're private or public, thinking holistically across the environment, social impact, human rights, and governance. So if I list, for example, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive or the Corporate Social Due Diligence Directive, which are two pieces of legislation that are going to be passed hopefully by the end of the year, but will put a lot of pressure on companies to disclose what they're doing regarding not only their enterprise value, but also what is their impact on the environment inwards and outwards? What is their impact on society inwards and outwards? How are they handling due diligence, human rights? And therefore it is putting as much business value, the environment, people, and the social element into a full equation for long-term value. So there's part of me that is somewhat optimistic to say that Europe is the most far-reaching region in the world compared to the United States, for example, that is focused mostly on climate. At the international level, we have climate disclosure, but they are looking at this holistically. It is pushing companies. It's hard. You know, there are choices that are going to have to be made, but it's looking towards a long-term view of what business needs to do to transform today according to an age of disruption, of broken value chains, of pandemics, and unfortunately also of major macro political challenges, as we know.
Great. Yeah, I think it's an interesting point because we've spoken a little bit about what we need from policy or what we would like to see from policy. But I think there is also a role for us to play as industry players, as industry actors. How do we facilitate that? How do we support the government in providing what we need to continue aviation? I know Rafael's spoken a little bit about alliances, and I think that's a great option, but how do we build on that so that it has real impact?
Well, may I? Okay, thank you. Just following back, I'm going to get there, but following back to Rafael talking about the last crisis, it was really hard. It was the hardest crisis of our history, our industry, but it was not the first one. And for sure won't be the last one, unfortunately, I have to tell you. We will have to prepare for the next one. And if we don't look at the root causes of why we got where we got and how the pandemic came to exacerbate existing problems, we are not going to be able to, on top of that, make policy changes to ensure a just transition. The transition towards a low-carbon aviation industry will inevitably bring changes in the job landscape, including retraining, redevelopment, even redundancies. So it's very important that these changes are managed with the respect of the workers and involving them in all the process. The adoption of these new technologies and fuels may introduce new health and safety issues and risks for workers. The exposure to hazardous substances, electrical hazards, fire risk, ergonomic challenges. These risks must be identified and mitigated from the outset of any climate-related measures rather than doing it afterwards. And to secure the future of the aviation industry, it's crucial to attract and retain young workers with fresh skills and innovative ideas. I mean, there's a lot of discussion around the Great Resignation. There's been a lot of discussion. We are still suffering of lack of workers in certain areas. And I was, just to give you an example, I was in a panel a few weeks ago with our partners from ground handling. Very interesting. And I mean, when talking about the Great Resignation and the causes and everything, there was a tendency of going to the short term, right? Let's go into TikTok and let's give away bunnies and, what we need to think is that the future generations are not going to be part of an industry that pollutes. So we have to be very serious on this transition. This transition needs to be fair for the existing workers, but also a magnet for the new generations coming in, because we need them. We are going to be needing them. So in order to go back to your question, and in order to pursue this just transition, it is vital for us to establish just transition committees at airport level and national level, where workers are included, and we could start the discussion of the need or the policies that are needed and go to the governments with an agreement from the industry and saying this is what we need, not just waiting for the government to react to what the government brings. We tried in the last assembly to take this position to ICAO. It was kind of welcome. We had a lot of support from the French government, actually. Laurent Pic, the ambassador in ICAO, was very supportive. But we still need to have a lot of work around this. We had a meeting in the ILO, International Labour Organization, where IATA, ATAG, ACI, several governments, the French government were there, and we agreed to put together a workshop to think of a task force that could deal with this at international level. We are working on it. It's work in progress. But for example, the Maritime already has a just transition task force with the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, the UN agency equivalent to ICAO, the ILO, bringing governments from the labor perspective, the workers and the employers. So if we can start that discussion in our industry like others are doing, we think that we are going to be able to provide with the right advice to the governments that need to lead the change.
And I think that point kind of fits very nicely with and links into my next question, which kind of exemplifies how sustainability is so intertwined. You touched on kind of making sure that we speak to the workers, and that aligns with the Fit for 55 package and the EU Green Deal and leaving no person and no place behind. How do we kind of expand that very European-centric view? Obviously, we're also sat here today in Paris, but I want to kind of expand that and think about the global perspective. So you mentioned your efforts to develop an international kind of strategy, but how do we really scale that?
I mean, I think it is important to always think of aviation as it is one of the true global industries. There are very few others like aviation that operate the same standards, the same way, no matter where you go in the world. It's a unique industry. It's also an industry that when it creates jobs, those jobs, the value of each of those jobs is usually a multiple of the average of the value of those jobs in any society. So as an industry, we've got an opportunity and I think a responsibility to create jobs, worthwhile jobs, good jobs. And so when we sort of try and link that back to the environment side, one of the biggest dangers, and in Europe, again, and this is, I'm trying to get away from a Eurocentric type of thinking, punish aviation, make it, try and restrict demand for aviation because that will help reduce emissions. There are many communities around the world that absolutely depend on aviation for their lifelines. We saw that with the volcano when the airspace in Europe was closed for more than 10 days. A lot of people who suffered there were not even in Europe. They were the farmers in Kenya and Ghana who couldn't get their crops to market. You could argue, well, should they be flying bananas from Ghana to Europe? That's a different question. The point was the fact that there was no aviation meant that there were huge communities that were affected negatively by the lack of connectivity. So I think that's something that we really need to think about. And I think the other thing is by making aviation flying more, I think the price needs to go up a bit because I think internalizing the cost of SAF is going to mean that fares at some point will need to increase. But think about the issue of aviation only becoming the right of the rich. Every person on this planet has an aspiration to travel, and we shouldn't take that away from people by raising the cost of aviation to a level where that's no longer affordable. So I think that's really important. And the other thing is, let's not forget the role that aviation plays in global health. I mean, we saw it through the pandemic. We saw it through the Ebola crisis in Africa a few years ago, where aviation is crucial for bringing in pharmaceuticals and treatment that normally wouldn't be able to get there. So there's a lot of aspects that are brought together there. It is a global industry. We need to attack it at the global level. And I think, more voices, more alliances and things, particularly with ICAO, it's their responsibility to manage international aviation on behalf of the UN. I think make those voices more loudly heard and do as we did in the environment, which is we were ahead of the game with governments. We were setting targets. We were saying, it's okay, you can agree to this because we know that we're going to be able to, it's going to be a struggle, but we know we're going to be able to get there. I think if we can do the same thing in the social aspects as well, that would be a good way forward. Tell governments what they need to be regulating and how they need to do it. They don't like it, because they think that they own everything when it comes to government, but I think it's something that has proven that you can actually do it.
Great, thank you. And I think COVID-19 was a challenging time for many sectors, particularly so for aviation. I think we realised that perhaps we were taking connectivity for granted, and it was a huge period of disruption with a lot of uncertainty. We are seeing that kind of slowly recover, which is extremely positive. We're seeing numbers kind of back up to where we expect them to be. But we need to ensure that we're more resilient to this in the future. So what type of governance is currently in place to support events such as this, and what do we need to kind of address that uncertainty and disruption?
It's a really important question, and one at BSR that we work on a lot with our members who are large multinational corporations across all sectors, but including aviation and transportation. And I'd like to say that there's not one single solution. As I mentioned earlier, we are in the age of rising stakeholder expectations. There are regulators, there are governments, there are investors, but there are also employees, there are citizens, and their entire value chains. And so governance has risen very high And as I mentioned, in terms of the European regulatory environment, there's been a shift now in the importance of governance. You know, the C-suite, boards of directors now have accountability and liability on the impacts that a company has on the environment and society. So there is a change, and there's a mind shift change also needed on how you see all this tied to your business. So there's one part of it today where C-suite, board of directors need to upskill and understand and wrap their heads around what is just transition, what is the environment, what are social impacts, what are human rights, and what is the direct link to the strategy and the business model and how this is going to play out on the long term in an age of continuous disruption. There's rising activism and impatience from employees. We talked about talent, being able to recruit the right type of talent, who don't find it acceptable that their companies would have a negative impact or be in a risk mitigation mode only when it comes to impacts on the environment and society with their business models. So there's a whole different type of leadership that is needed, one that has accountability, one that has tone from the top. But there's also another point. We think that governance and leadership only happens in the C-suite and board of directors. In fact, it's happening across the entire company. So I have a message for our younger generation who's out there. You don't have to wait 20 years to jump the corporate ladder to make it up to the C-suite and the board to be able to have a positive impact on a company or whatever activity or organization you're doing. In today's world, sustainability, the environment, social impact is distributed across the company. It's no longer just the role of the Chief Sustainability Officer. It's as much the role of the CFO, of the risk, of procurement, of the CMO, audit, etc. And it happens top down and bottom up. So that's one point. The second point I also want to say is we've talked about partnerships. And there's a different way that we also have to think of companies or governance role in the private sector towards society. And that's thinking more at a value chain and an ecosystem level. At BSR, we work with companies on insights, advisory, but collaboration also. Because we recognize that no company can have change alone. You need a whole group to turn around and bring against a systemic shift. And one collaborative initiative that we started last year in partnership with the B team is in fact called Energy for a Just Transition. We're 1 year into a 3-year partnership that is working together for a transition to a net zero economy. We've brought together many actors, and we've shared some lessons learned regarding this collaboration, because I think also you have to be honest on the journey. It's a time for authenticity. It's not just a time to turn around and say, everything's perfect. I've got my net zero plan. I know where I'm going. Now leave me alone. It's in fact extremely challenging in an age of disruption where we have COVID, we have value chains, we have war. You know, this is very, very difficult. So if you'll bear with me for one moment, I just want to share what are the 7 lessons learned that we've seen in terms of collaboration and also that impact governance and leadership. The first one is ambition matters, but it's not enough. You need resources to make this happen. So leaders and leaders and C-suites and governance in general have to think about what are the resources you need to put in place to make this happen. And you also need tone from the top, including incentives and remuneration. The second thing is that just transition is also engaging in social dialogue. And I think you've talked a lot about it. There are human people that are behind this. There are real workers. And you need to think of that human angle. The third thing is it's a cross-functional challenge. It involves everyone across the organization and beyond. It's as much R&D as it is the C-suite and other parts. And they need to work together to rethink their services and their offerings from inception all the way to out to the market and circularity again. The fourth thing is we need collaboration. We've talked about collaboration for systemic change. Transition out is different from transition in. It's not about leaving an industry, but it's also how do you transition it. And that the just transition is impossible without stakeholder engagement. So you have to think beyond an individual company to the value chain. And finally, corporate action is not enough. And I think we've talked about the government, about policies. You have to work with a lot of different actors to bring across this change. So it's a journey. It's not a short-term action. It's not a knee-jerk. It's not changing the C-suite. It's not changing the board. It has to happen across the organization, across the value chain, and across many different players.
Thank you. Yeah.
So maybe I was thinking, well, actually listening previously to what Paul mentioned about, ICAOs and the need to, aviation being a global type of business, right, which require a lot of stakeholders to be able to work together to make it happen, right? This connectivity that we have, that we take for granted, actually. So I think, in linking this to, I think we have seen, I guess, the dynamics have changed, right? So the dynamics in the world has changed, right? And in this sense, I think we, as Christine was describing, in the organization, we have to take a different approach. I think we also have to bear in mind, because of the global nature of aviation, I think government and institutions will have to take a different approach. And I was thinking of an example again when you mentioned, Paul, because I remember maybe a month ago or so, I had a meeting with the secretary, because one of the things that we're doing is trying to meet other stakeholders or other organizations, right? Because it's a different, different set of priorities, right? So I had a meeting with the Secretary of State of one of our Northern European states, right? For energy, by the way. Yeah? So the Secretary of State for energy, to understand, what is, and explain our, in a way, the industry, but at the same time understand the priorities and the plans for that country to address this, right? I was a very good meeting. I was very surprised to see that, and very honestly, the Secretary of State had no clear view of what the priority was, right? So the good thing was that we had a very good relationship with the Secretary of State. So, and I mentioned, a couple of hours later, I'm going to meet the Secretary of State for Transport, right? So, but that Secretary of State immediately picked up the phone and actually called the Transport Secretary of State for Transport to ask, what is that you're doing? What do we need to do? So again, here we have to be able to think about this in a much more, I think, Christine, you were explaining it from the corporate world, right? But I think it applies also to the states, right? Where we do need this collaboration. If we have used the word collaboration, we have used the word involving different levels of the organization. And this seems to be, and one of the things that I personally at least have seen by expanding the stakeholders that we usually have talked around, right? And I mentioned energy, but it's not only, right? That we will be able to bring more a just transition as we are aiming to. Otherwise, it will be quite difficult, right? Quite restrictive. So I just wanted to comment on that.
I think just coming back to aviation and just using the pandemic, COVID, as an example, I'm actually quite critical of our industry because, many companies needed to survive. Suddenly their revenues stopped from one day to the next, and that must be a horrible position for any CEO to be in. And of course, that leads to quick action. We've got to take quick action to survive. And one of the results of that were high levels of redundancies or people laid off, with the result that when operations started again, they didn't have the skill. It wasn't just about bodies. It was about the skills and the experience that those people had. And one of the reasons why it was so difficult, I think this industry and also the gastronomy industry, is people who were laid off started to look for other jobs and realized that they didn't need to work weird hours. They didn't need to do it for very low levels of pay. So I think the point I'm trying to make is, in terms of social justice, companies need to do a better job of recognizing the true value of their employees and not just see them as a switch on, switch off resource. If that's one of the learnings that they could take out of COVID, I think that would be a very valuable one.
Definitely, and I think, those few examples really demonstrate that knowledge is power, and it's definitely something that we've seen at ICF. I think some of the most impactful work that I've been involved in has been training on sustainable aviation fuels. It sounds, very simple, just kind of talking to people about the things that we deal with every day, but actually equipping people with that knowledge really kind of gives them the ability to tackle the problem themselves. So by kind of casting our net wider, if you like, and making sure that we all have a good understanding of the challenges, the opportunities, and what we can do about it is really important. So I think, kind of building on the question of governance and uncertainty, I'm going to ask you all a question. I will ask you to all answer the question as to what your organisation's transformation strategy is from a resilience perspective. So I really want to kind of think about what have you learned from your career, from other strategies in terms of building resilience. Maybe what is the kind of most impactful thing that you've seen in terms of industry climate change action, but maybe the thing that you regret a little bit. Who would like to answer first? No pressure.
Well, I don't know if I have some really impactful case, but one of the things that, we talked about the impact of COVID on all of us in our life, right? And what happened, well, in this industry, obviously. But I think when we saw the skies empty of airplanes and all of us were locked down and everything, we were initially, I think, trying to cope with it, right? But what I think was a key factor, and we were talking about, again, just transition, or we were talking about, inclusion, or, I think one of the things that we found, and I value a lot, was that the building of relationships, right, that we have throughout the years, right, actually paid off being this lockdown. And I know this is very common to all, but actually reflecting on that, but also reflecting on, so how do we improve on using the technology that we have, but we still maintain that connection. And therefore, after the pandemic, many of the practices that we have put in place as an emergency procedure, let's say, right, in terms of how we communicate, became common practice, right? So therefore, we are becoming, at the same time, more sustainable. Honestly, I'm traveling much less, let's say, right? Meaning I am becoming more conscious about it. When can I actually use the technology? This is a simple one. I know it touches everyone here. It was very simple, but I reflected on it. But honestly, the other thing is we do still have to build those relationships, because we depend on, especially as a global industry, on those relationships that we have. So again, talking about the talent, how do we retain that talent, right? Because if you are high rotation, for example, in certain positions in this industry, is not the ideal thing, right? I mean, I guess we were talking, or I was mentioning before a little bit about air traffic management, right? So I don't know how many people know how long it takes to, maybe there are some people in the audience that are air traffic controllers, so you know how long it takes to train and prepare an air traffic controller, right? But it takes quite a few years, right? So it depends where you are, but it could be 2, 3, or 4 years, right? So again, you cannot afford to, and it's very, very important that we retain the talent, maintain the connections, but at the same time, we do use, better use of the lessons that we have learned from this crisis. It's a simple one, but I thought I'm really still kind of enjoying the benefit of it, because I'm able to still maintain the connection, but I'm also, I think we kept practices there that are maintaining even closer connections with people, but not necessarily, traveling as much as we said for unnecessary reasons, right?
Yeah, simple but effective, I think.
Well, if very short answer, then I took the train to come here. Sorry, Rafael, I didn't take the plane. No, but thinking on going back to the pandemic and the issues that I think we all raised, and the difficulties of the hardest crisis of our history, I think that a very good example of resilience was the governments that could react and could support the workers, the companies, to retain the skills, to avoid the difficulties here that Paul mentioned. And then they didn't pay it with long queues in the airports or hard difficulties to bring back the workers. Of course, they all had problems. We are still paying a high price. But I think that our reaction, our joint reaction into going, in some cases together at national level, the airlines, the airports, the employees, the unions, going together to the government and say, we are desperate, we need some support because we need to keep at least the skills for the bounce afterwards. I think that paid off. Of course, we're having inflation, we're paying it, you somehow pay it sooner or later. But at least those governments that were more keen to react, to retain that workforce are the ones that are seeing the results right now. And this is a lesson, I think, we need to learn, if that was the aim of your question, Isobel.
Yeah, that's great. And I think kind of your point on having that joint reaction is really important. I think it was one of those few times in history where, you know, everybody was impacted. So everybody is now responding together. So thank you. Over to you, Paul.
So I guess from my perspective, and for the young generation in this audience, aviation is still one of the most exciting industries on this planet. We fulfill dreams that people for thousands and thousands of years weren't able to do. And we do it every day. We fly millions of people around the world. And that's something that we should never be afraid of being proud of. In terms of resilience, I think as an industry, we've demonstrated resilience many times. If you go back, you know, there was the year Y2K. Some of you may not even remember that, you know, those of us who lived it, at the millennium, the changeover. We went through 9/11, which was, you know, threatened to ground the whole global fleet of aviation. We've been through the volcano, we've been through the pandemic, we've been through an Ebola outbreak, and each time the industry is able to respond. The issue of climate change and environmental performance probably posed a greater threat to the industry than any of those things, because at the time we didn't know how to address it. And we even had, I remember when I first started, the Bishop of London came out and said that flying was a sin. So basically, if you flew, you were never going to heaven. And you weren't going to fly there anyway, but you know, these are the sorts of things we're dealing with. So the thing I learned, and I think is still true today, that you can work together. You can bring completely different stakeholders together, and as long as you find a common vocabulary, common objectives, and a common will, you will actually be able to make things happen. And the biggest regret that I have is actually that we didn't engage the finance sector earlier in our efforts, because one thing I've learned through the years, whether that was in aviation or anywhere else, is that money is what makes it happen. And I think if we'd engaged the finance sector earlier on things like SAF and some of the other things, we'd be a little bit further forward than we are today. So never forget the power of the finance sector to translate what you want to do into concrete action.
It's that point on collaboration again, isn't it? And making sure that we're all kind of in this together.
So I have a personal and a professional answer, if you'll bear with me. I left the corporate world in the middle of the pandemic because I had my own personal light bulb moment where I woke up one morning and I said, the world's in a really crazy place. I love what I do, but I don't feel that I'm having an impact on making a real change to the world. And so I was looking to join something that had a completely different way of responding and hopefully impacting the world towards a just and sustainable world, following a different business model. So after 23 years in the corporate world, I joined BSR, which is a not-for-profit sustainability advisory, working with the corporate world, but from a different angle to have impact. So my biggest regret is I actually didn't jump off that train and join it earlier, because I am re-inspired now about what is happening, not only in the corporate world, but alliances, collaborations, ecosystems to respond to today's climate crisis, today's social crisis, today's humanitarian crisis, and that there's a raised consciousness and awareness, I think, today, all the way to the citizen and the employee level than there was maybe 3-4 years ago. It's personal, it touches you, you're human beings. Now, my professional response on resilience is one of the first projects I had when I joined BSR in the middle of the pandemic was working on the strategy of one of the largest pharmaceutical companies, who I shall not name, but who was among those who brought the vaccine. And that was a pretty exhilarating experience. And what we did do with them is we worked with them a lot on scenario planning. We couldn't have foreseen the pandemic. We couldn't have foreseen the volcano in 2010. And I was stranded in New York City, by the way. We couldn't have foreseen many of the things that we saw, but we've learned that, in fact, what we have to do is use future scenarios to start understanding how do you pivot your strategy, how do you pivot your resources, how do you pivot your leadership across multiple different resources so that you have more agility to deal with this world of disruption, and also to better understand and respond to stakeholder expectations. So in building resilience, for us from BSR, it's not only about thinking about long-term value, it's not only thinking about collaborations and partnerships, it's not only thinking about the human, the social, the human rights, and the environmental, but it's also that important foresight. How are you pivoting your business strategy and your activities across multiple potential scenarios, and how are you making this a regular business activity in your governance across it to be able to respond in the same way that the world came together in the pandemic and learn from that as well?
Thank you. And I wonder whether if you had kind of jumped off the corporate train a little bit earlier on, whether the same opportunities for change would be there. We've seen so much evolution across sustainability, over the past 5, 10 plus years. And we're still seeing, evolution in that story. We've spoken today about artificial intelligence and the role that has to play in kind of the expanding kind of reach of sustainability across our industry. So yeah, I think insightful that you kind of wish you'd done that earlier, but I wonder whether you would have reached the same outcome.
If I can just add a little thing here, and I think, Isobel, we had this conversation. A few panelists raised it earlier today. When I was Chief Sustainability Officer 10 years ago, we actually didn't call this sustainability. We called it innovation. We were doing energy efficiency of technologies as a way of reducing costs, staying ahead, making game changers, groundbreaking innovation that had a societal and environmental purpose, but actually was innovation to stay ahead of the game and hopefully also make a positive contribution to the entire industry and to the world at large. Today we call it sustainability. We might call it long-term value. We also have just transition, climate justice, social justice, and all these other terms. But I think fundamentally it has always been there. It's just we've seen it from a different prism or lens, trying to put the two words together. What I find really exciting about today, though, is it's all coming together. You no longer have to fight to make the link to the business strategy. It's inherent in the strategy, and it's part of risk mitigation, but it's also about opportunities and innovation. And you no longer have to fight to get the attention of the C-suite or the boards. They're coming to you and asking you more questions. And somebody asked me, and I said, what for you is a successful meeting when you're with a board meeting, with a board member or a CEO or a C-suite or whoever it is? And I said, it's the amount of times they interrupt me in 15 minutes. It's because they've understood, or they're beginning to lean into the dilemma that we face and the new type of thinking that we need. So while there's a lot of noise and a lot of negativity, and some prime ministers saying that they don't want people to be imposed 7 recycling bins in their homes, and we can find all sorts of analogies that we want, I do think it's a terribly exciting period to be in because of the stakeholder expectations, because of the urgency to act, and because people not only want a sustainable present, they also want a livable future. And there's a whole younger generation that is out there and that sees things in a different innovative mindset and business model. And this is the drive that we need forward for the aviation industry and for all industries at large.
Thank you. So I think we have been given a lot of food for thought throughout this panel. Hopefully you've had some light bulb moments in terms of your own kind of impact. And I'd really like to open up the floor to questions. So if you would like to ask anything to the panel, please put your hand up and we will make sure that a microphone comes to you. No questions. Okay, so I think that all that's left to say then is kind of thank you to ENAC for having us today. I would like to kind of follow the panel up with just a 30-second summary of what you think the one thing that the aviation should prioritize in their quest for sustainability.
Well, aviation has, the fly net zero objective, obviously. I believe we have to probably communicate our objectives and our achievements more to the general public, right? Because obviously within the industry is one thing, right? But you mentioned the moment we're living, the expectations of society, right? So I think we need to reach out more effectively. And I will leave it there, 30 seconds, you said, sorry.
Well, mine is the obvious, maybe. I think we heard social dialogue, we heard bring stakeholders into the discussion, we heard collaboration. Let's do it. Let's keep on doing it. Let's ensure that we are all together fighting for a just transition. Let's have a look at it with hope, with resources as well, hopefully, but also with a clear vision and trusting each other. You know that trust, it takes you years to build it and 5 minutes to destroy it. And I think going through the pandemic was a big test, and we have lessons learned from that time. Let's use them there. Let's use them to tackle this new challenge that we have ahead.
I would just say we need to deliver. We know we've got a plan. The industry's got a very clear vision about how it's going to get to carbon neutral by 2050. We now need to deliver. And I think we need to show on a regular basis the progress that's being made. And I think above all, we need, as an industry, the industry needs to communicate. It needs to communicate and over-communicate, because we're still not being understood. We're not being heard. We're not being understood by the people that matter, the people that make policy. And there's a huge challenge yet to do that.
Oh, I think everything's been said, but I would say act. Definitely communicate in the public awareness. Bring people along on the journey in an authentic and honest way. Again, it's great to have these sophisticated goals and targets, but you have to be able to explain the challenges that you're doing and continue dialogue, I would say, as well. So act, communicate in an honest, authentic way, and continue the dialogue, and don't lose faith.
Thank you, and thank you, panel members, for this discussion, and for the audience for staying for the last session of the day. I hope you've enjoyed yourself, and it's been great to meet you.
Thank you Isabelle, thank you all. Voilà, c'est la fin de cette journée. Juste vous remercier de votre participation, remercier Marc Walla d'avoir organisé de main de maître une nouvelle fois ces 4e journées. Juste quelques rappels également, d'autres événements seront organisés donc par l'ENAC Alumni, inauguration des nouveaux locaux d'Envol, la junior entreprise de l'ENAC, et les 30 ans d'Envol, ce sera le 10 octobre 2019, octobre 2023, c'est-à-dire dans une semaine. Le gala Les Alumni attendu le 17 novembre, et le hackathon organisé par le club entrepreneurial Flying Impulse. Voilà. Je vous remercie à tous. d'être venu, d'avoir participé à ces débats et à ces ateliers. Et bonne soirée à tous. Merci.